She got dressed for that dinner like it was the best night of her life. She curled her hair, she did her makeup, she stood in front of the mirror in that beautiful gown, and she smiled at herself, a real smile, not the careful kind she had practiced her whole life. Because her mother had given her a dress and a reservation card. And for the first time in 24 years, Simone Harper believed her family had finally chosen her. She had no idea she was already sold. And the man walking into that room wasn't coming to meet her. He was coming to collect her. He was supposed to be the worst thing that ever happened to her, but they both have no idea he was about to become the best. Comment sold if you think her family are evil and never really giving her a choice. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because this is just the beginning of Simone's story, and what comes next will change everything.
Simone Harper sat there thinking it was her night. 30 floors above the city, she kept checking her reflection in the glass instead of her phone. Like the moment might disappear if she stopped looking at herself. The dress fit perfectly. Her hair fell exactly the way she practiced. Her smile, soft, careful, hopeful, didn't feel like a performance for once. It felt real because her mother had given her a dress, because there was a reservation at a place she had only ever seen in magazines, because for the first time in 24 years, Simone believed something simple. Maybe they finally saw her. 17 minutes passed like that. 17 minutes where nothing was wrong. 17 minutes where she didn't know her name was already written on a deal she never agreed to. And then the elevator opened. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand who Simone Harper was before that night. Because the girl who walked into that penthouse and the woman who walked out of it were not the same person. And the difference between them? That's this story. Simone grew up in a house that was full of love. Just not for her. That sounds harsh, and maybe it is, but it's the truth, and this story only works if we tell the truth from the beginning. Her family wasn't cruel. They didn't shout at her or lock her in rooms or treat her badly in ways that anyone watching from the outside would have been able to point at and say, there, that's the problem, that's the damage being done. It was quieter than that. It was the way her father's whole face changed when her brother Elijah walked into a room. The way it lit up. The way he sat up straighter, like something important had just arrived. And then the way that same face went back to neutral when Simone walked in behind him. Not cold, not mean. Neutral. Like a man looking at a piece of furniture he had forgotten was there. Simone noticed this when she was 6 years old. She didn't have words for it yet. She just felt it. That specific feeling of being looked at and not really seen. Like being made of glass. Like the person looking at you is actually looking through you at something more interesting on the other side. By the time she was 10, she understood the logic of it. Her family believed in something, a very specific, very old idea that they had never questioned because nobody in their world had ever given them a reason to. Sons carry the name forward. Sons build the legacy. Sons are the ones you pour everything into. The best schools, the best tutors, the best opportunities, because sons are the investment that pays out for generations. Daughters are different. Daughters grow up, marry out, and become someone else's story. You take care of them, sure. You feed them and clothe them and keep them safe. But you don't build your empire around something you're eventually going to give away. That was the theology of the Harper household. And Elijah, her older brother by 3 years, tall and charming and genuinely talented in ways that made it hard to resent him completely, was the center of it. He got the better room, the better school, the summer programs, the business mentorship from their father's contacts, the birthday parties that the whole family made an effort for. Simone got birthdays too, a cake, a gift, the expected things, but not the effort. Never quite the effort. She used to tell herself it didn't bother her. She got very good at telling herself things that weren't true, living in that house. What she actually did, the real Simone, the one she kept tucked away where nobody could see it or dismiss it, was build a whole inner world that had nothing to do with her family's approval. She read everything she could find. Not because anyone told her to, nobody was monitoring her reading habits or impressed by her grades the way they were impressed by Elijah's, but because books were the one place where she wasn't furniture, where she could be inside someone else's story and feel, for a few hours at a time, like she mattered to the narrative. She taught herself things quietly: languages, history, how money worked, how businesses were built and destroyed. She absorbed information the way some people absorb sunlight, not because someone handed it to her, but because she was always turned toward it, always reaching. She had a good mind, an exceptional one, actually. Nobody in her family knew, because nobody in her family was paying close enough attention. And so Simone Harper moved through her own childhood like a ghost in her own house, present at every table, absent from every plan. Patient. Always patient. Because somewhere underneath all of that quiet and all of that stillness and all of those years of making herself easy and undemanding and small enough to fit in the space that was never actually designed for her, she believed. She believed that one day they would look up, that one day something would shift, that her mother would call her into the kitchen and really talk to her, that her father would look at her the way he looked at Elijah and she would finally understand what she had been missing, that one day she would be chosen. She held on to that belief for 24 years, right up until the night someone handed her proof, in writing, with 3 signatures and a notary stamp, that she had never been chosen at all. She had been saved. Saved for a transaction. The dress appeared on a Tuesday. Not handed to her with ceremony or explanation, just laid across her bed when she came home that evening. A garment bag. Her name written on a small card attached to the zipper in her mother's handwriting. She stood in her doorway and looked at it for a moment. Then she crossed the room and unzipped the bag. The gown inside was the most beautiful thing anyone in her family had ever given her. She didn't know what it meant yet. She didn't ask. She was afraid in the way she had always been afraid, of questioning gifts, of prodding at good things too hard in case they turned out to be less good than they looked. There was a second card inside the bag, a restaurant name, a date, tonight, a time, 8 o'clock, a penthouse suite number written below it, in her mother's careful handwriting. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the gown again. And Simone Harper, who had spent 24 years waiting to be chosen, decided that this was it. This was the moment. Maybe her parents had organized a family dinner, a special occasion. Maybe her father had finally done something, had seen something in her that he'd been slow to acknowledge, and this was his way of making it right. Maybe her mother had simply wanted to do something beautiful for her. She didn't know, and she didn't ask. She got dressed. Slowly, carefully. The way you dress when you're afraid that moving too fast will prove it isn't real. She did her hair the way she liked it, not the way she wore it on ordinary days when nobody was looking, but the way she had always wanted to wear it for an occasion that mattered. She did her makeup with the same care. She stood in front of the mirror when she was finished, and she looked at herself for a long time. She looked beautiful. She felt beautiful. And for the first time in a very long time, she let herself feel it without immediately finding a reason to take it away. She picked up her small clutch bag, slipped into her shoes, and walked to the elevator at the end of her building's hallway, with her chin slightly higher than usual. She didn't see her mother on the way out. She didn't see her father. She didn't see Elijah. The apartment was quiet. Like everyone had somewhere else to be. She told herself they were probably already there, waiting for her. She told herself she was probably the last one running, and that thought made her smile a little. The idea of being the one they were all waiting for once. She got into the car she'd ordered and watched the city move past the windows, bright and alive and completely indifferent to the particular hope she was carrying in her chest. And she didn't feel the indifference. She just felt the hope. The penthouse was on the 30th floor. The elevator opened directly into a private dining room, and for a moment, just a moment, Simone forgot to be nervous. Because it was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. The entire city below, lit up and sprawling like something that had been arranged specifically to be beautiful for this evening. A single round table set for 2 in the center of the room. White linen, crystal glasses, Candles, pale gold light everywhere, warm and still. Not a family dinner. A table for two. She stepped out of the elevator, and the doors closed behind her, and she stood in the middle of all that light and all that stillness and tried to recalibrate. A table for two. Her mother had arranged this for her? A date? An introduction? She didn't have time to think through what that meant before she noticed the view again and decided, almost immediately, to simply be present. To let the evening be whatever it was going to be. To not overthink it or pick at it or find the edges where it didn't make sense. She sat down at the table. She checked her phone. No messages. She set it face down on her clutch and looked at the city. And for 17 minutes, sitting alone in the most beautiful room she had ever been in, wearing a gown her mother had chosen for her, waiting for whatever this evening was going to bring, Simone Harper was happy. Really, fully, genuinely happy. The kind of happy that only exists when you have been waiting for something for a very long time, and you finally believe it is here. Those 17 minutes were the last uncomplicated happiness she would feel for a very long time. Then the elevator opened. She heard them before she saw them. Not voices, just the quality of movement, the kind of coordinated, deliberate stillness that a group of people has when they are trained to occupy space in a specific way. When they are not a group of friends or a family arriving for dinner, but something else, something with a different kind of purpose. She turned. There were 6 of them, men in dark suits, not threatening in any obvious way, but with that particular quality of stillness that made the word bodyguard form in her mind before she had time to think it through. They spread out across the room without speaking. 2 by the elevator. 2 near the windows. 2 flanking the space between them. And then he walked in. Kang Dae-won. She didn't know his name yet. She would learn it later, from the documents, from the way his staff said it with a very specific quality of care, like a name you handle gently, because dropping it could have consequences. But she looked at him, and she understood immediately that this was not a date her mother had arranged. This was not a family dinner. This was not anything she had prepared herself for. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who carries weight, not just physical weight, but the weight of decisions, of power, of a world that reorganizes itself slightly every time he enters a room. His face was sharp and still. Dark eyes that moved across the space with the calm efficiency of someone assessing and cataloging without emotional commentary. He was not unattractive. That wasn't the point. He was simply present in a way that most people weren't. The kind of present that displaced air. He looked at her, not the way she had hoped to be looked at tonight, not with warmth or recognition or the soft, specific attention of a person who is happy to see you, like a document, like something he needed to review before proceeding. He crossed to the table and sat down across from her without greeting her, without introducing himself, without acknowledging the strangeness of the situation in any way that would have made it easier to navigate. He sat down, reached inside his jacket, and placed a black folder on the table between them. He slid it across to her. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. He nodded once, toward the folder. She opened it. The first page was a contract, the kind of document that has multiple parties listed at the top, with full legal names and identification numbers, and dense paragraphs of language that most people need a lawyer to translate. But the numbers didn't need translation. They were large, extraordinarily large. Numbers that belonged to a life she had not known her family was living. Debt accumulated over years. Not one bad decision, not one crisis, but a slow and steady accumulation of money borrowed and obligations ignored and payments deferred until the total had grown into something that could not be managed quietly anymore. She turned the page. More contracts, more numbers, different dates, different lenders, different terms, all pointing in the same direction, all adding up to the same impossible sum. She turned another page. Her father's signature. She recognized it immediately. She had seen it on school forms and birthday cards her whole life, That particular combination of loops and angles that was so specifically his, she turned another page. Her brother's signature. Elijah's signature. Countersigned. Dated. Witnessed. She read the date twice because the first time it didn't process correctly. 3 weeks ago. He had signed this 3 weeks ago. She turned to the final page. There was a single line at the bottom, below all the legal language and all the clause numbers and all the formal structure of a document designed to make a terrible thing look like a reasonable transaction. Simone Harper, transfer of responsibility. She read it once. She read it again. Then she set the page down very carefully. The way you set something down when you are afraid that if you put it down too fast, it will make a sound, and the sound will make it real. She looked at the signatures again. Her father, her brother, her father, who had never once looked at her the way he looked at Elijah, who had signed his daughter over to a stranger without calling her first, without sitting her down, without explaining, without, and this was the part that would stay with her the longest, that would surface in quiet moments for years afterward, without appearing to struggle with it. The notary stamp was neat. The date was neat. The signatures were neat. It had not been a difficult signing. Her brother, the golden child, the future, the legacy, the one the family had organized itself around. Elijah, who had grown up with every advantage and every investment and every believing look their father had ever given, Elijah had looked at this document 3 weeks ago and put his name on the line that transferred his sister to a stranger and then gone home and eaten dinner and watched television and continued his life without a single detectable disruption. She understood now why her mother hadn't come with her tonight. She understood why the apartment had been quiet when she left. She understood the gown. Not a gift. A costume. She had been dressed for delivery. No tears came. She noticed this with a distant, observational part of her mind, the part that had learned to watch her own reactions the way a scientist watches an experiment. She had expected tears. She had expected something to break open. Instead, there was just silence. A deep, wide, indoor silence that had nothing to do with the room she was sitting in and everything to do with something inside her that had just, very quietly, stopped. Not broken, not collapsed, closed. Like a door that had been held open for 24 years by a person who finally understood that nobody was coming through it. She set the folder down. She smoothed the front of her gown, the gown her mother had chosen for this specifically, for the night her daughter would be transferred, and she looked at Kang Dae-won. She looked at him directly, without flinching, without performing composure, because composure requires effort and she was beyond effort now, into something much simpler on the other side of it. "I understand," she said. Her voice was even, not forced even, just even. Pausa. Then she stood up, straightened, picked up her clutch. "I'm ready," she said quietly. "I wouldn't want to waste your time." Kang Dae-won had not moved. He was watching her with an expression that she would come to recognize later, that very specific quality of attention he gave to things that surprised him, which was almost nothing, which was almost never anything. He had done this before. Not this exactly, but the shape of it, the collection of a debt in human form, the conversion of obligation into asset. He knew how these moments went. There was always a reaction. There was always something to manage fear or anger, or the particular ugliness of someone trying to negotiate at the very last second when all the leverage was already gone. He had never seen this. He watched her stand and smooth her gown and look at him with eyes that were not afraid and not performing bravery and not asking him for anything. Eyes that had simply gone somewhere very still and clear, on the other side of something he understood. In that moment, he had underestimated, and something shifted in him, small, barely detectable. The kind of shift you only notice later, when you look back and try to find the exact moment things began to change. He stood. He nodded once, and Simone Harper picked up her small clutch, lifted her chin slightly, and walked out of the most beautiful room she had ever been in. She did not look back. The drive to his estate took 40 minutes. She spent it looking out the window, not crying, not planning, not running through what she should have done differently or what she was going to do now or whether there was any version of the next 24 hours that looked like escape. Just looking at the city moving past. At one point, her phone buzzed. A message from her mother. She looked at it for a long moment. Then, she put the phone face down in her lap and went back to watching the city. She didn't respond. Not because she was performing strength. She wasn't performing anything. She was just empty of the particular fuel that responses require. The part of her that had always turned toward her family, always oriented itself in their direction, always reached for connection, even when connection wasn't being offered back. That part had gone very quiet. She looked out the window until the city became suburb, and the suburb became the wide, gated approach to something that could only be called an estate. Stone walls, old trees, a driveway that curved through manicured grounds, lit with warm ground-level lights that made the whole approach look like something from a magazine. The car stopped. A door was opened for her. She stepped out into the cool air and stood for a moment looking at the house. It was extraordinary. Not cold or intimidating, or rather, it was both of those things, but in the way that very old power is those things. Not trying to be, just there. Existing in its own magnitude without any need to perform it. Someone appeared at her side. A woman. Staff, by the way she carried herself. "I'll show you to your room," the woman said. Simone nodded. She followed. She did not ask questions. She did not make demands. She did not ask to speak to Kang Dae-won, or request an explanation, or try to negotiate the terms of whatever this arrangement was. She simply followed the woman through the wide, bright corridors of the most beautiful home she had ever entered, and looked at everything with her quiet, observational eyes, and filed it all away. She was here. She didn't choose this. But she was here. And Simone Harper, who had spent 24 years surviving in rooms that were not designed for her, understood, with the deep, practical intelligence of someone who has always had to be more resourceful than they were given credit for, what surviving in this room required. Pay attention. Understand the system. Disappear into it until you understand it well enough to know what to do next. She had been doing this her whole life. She could do it here. If you're already feeling something for Simone right now, good. Hold on to that feeling, because this story is about to get so much better. Stay with us. The room they gave her was on the second floor, east wing, large, bright, a window that faced the gardens, a bathroom with white marble and good light, a wardrobe that had been stocked. She opened it and looked at the clothes hanging there and understood that her arrival had been planned for in practical ways she had not been consulted about. She changed out of the gown. She hung it carefully in the wardrobe, not out of sentiment. Just because it was a beautiful thing, and folding it carelessly felt wrong even now. She washed her face, changed into something simpler. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window. Outside, the gardens were lit with soft, warm light. She could see the edges of what looked like a walking path, trees, a stone bench, everything manicured and intentional and peaceful in the particular way that very expensive outdoor spaces are peaceful like stillness that has been curated rather than simply found. She sat there for a long time. Then she lay down. She thought she wouldn't sleep. She slept. The first week passed in a particular kind of quiet. Simone moved through the estate carefully, learning its geography, the corridors, the rooms, which spaces were clearly private and which were shared. Learning the rhythms of the staff, who moved with the efficiency of people in a well-organized system and treated her with the specific kind of respectful neutrality that told her they had been instructed to do so. She was not a prisoner. That was the first thing she checked, in her quiet, methodical way. The gates were controlled, yes. And she had no car and no obvious means of simply leaving, but she was not watched in the way prisoners are watched. There were no guards outside her room. Her door was not locked. She had her phone. She had access to the house's Wi-Fi. She could have called someone. She could have reached out. She could have built some kind of case for herself. She thought about it. Then she thought about where that went, about what calling someone meant. Calling who, exactly? Her family had signed the documents. Her father, her brother. She had no one on the other side of a phone call who had demonstrated, with their actual behavior rather than just their words, that they would choose her. So she didn't call. She observed instead. She learned the way Kang Dae-won's household operated the staff's schedules, the flow of visitors, the texture of his days as visible from the edges. He was in his office by early morning. He had calls through the late morning. He ate lunch alone or not at all. He worked through the afternoon. Dinner was sometimes at the estate, sometimes not. He had not spoken to her directly since the penthouse, not avoiding her. She had the sense that he simply moved through his life with such complete focus on what he was doing that the things at the periphery only registered when they required attention. She was not yet requiring attention. That was fine. She read. The estate had a library, a real one, 2 stories tall, with a rolling ladder, and more books than she could count. And she discovered it on day 3 and made it her base of operations. She made herself tea in the kitchen each morning, early, before most of the staff were active, and carried it to the library and read until the household woke up around her. The staff began to expect her there. One of them, a quiet young woman named Hyun, started leaving a small plate of something beside the tea kettle in the mornings. Not asked for, just offered. Simone noticed this. She thanked her. It was such a small thing, a plate of fruit and something sweet, left by someone who had simply paid enough attention to see that she ate very little in the mornings and decided, on her own initiative, to help with that. She sat with her tea and her fruit and her book in the enormous bright library, and she thought, someone in this house sees me. It was a small thought. She didn't make too much of it, but it sat warmly somewhere in her chest for the rest of the day. Kang Dae-won was aware of her, the way he was aware of everything in his environment, completely and without commentary. He had cameras, not an unusual fact for a man in his position, who had spent enough years accumulating the specific kind of power that makes enemies as a natural byproduct. The estate was thoroughly monitored, and he reviewed feeds when relevant and otherwise let his security chief handle the daily reality of it. But he found himself checking the East Wing feeds. Not because anything concerning was happening there, because something was happening there that he kept returning to with an attention he couldn't fully account for. She was just there, every morning in the library before anyone else was awake, moving through his home with the quiet care of someone who understood that they were in a borrowed space and was treating it accordingly. Not servile about it, not trying to make herself invisible out of fear, just considerate, measured, taking up exactly as much space as she needed and not 1 inch more. He watched her read. He watched her have small exchanges with the staff, brief, warm, genuine. He watched Hyun leave the morning plate, and he watched Simone find it and stand there for a moment, with something moving across her face before she composed herself and poured her tea. He watched her sit at the library window in the late afternoons when the light was turning gold and read with her knees pulled up and her tea going cold beside her because she had forgotten it. He kept waiting for the performance to reveal itself. That was his experience of people, that everyone was performing something, and patience always eventually showed you what was underneath the performance. But there was no performance. She was simply herself. In his house, in the borrowed space of a life she had not chosen, she was simply, quietly, completely herself. He could not remember the last time he had met someone like that. He told himself it was interesting in a clinical sense, that it was simply unusual enough to warrant observation in the way that unusual things warrant observation. He told himself that for 2 weeks. On the 15th day, he went home earlier than scheduled. He came in through the main entrance and crossed the front hall and was headed toward his office when he passed the library. The door was open. The library was lit by the last of the afternoon sun, that particular late gold that comes through west-facing windows in the final hour before sunset and makes everything it touches look like it has been painted. Simone was asleep in the chair by the window, a book open in her lap, her head tilted slightly toward the light, her face completely unguarded, in the way that sleep makes faces unguarded, without the habitual composure she carried when she was awake, without the careful stillness. Just a person, asleep, with the sun on her face. He stopped. He stood in the doorway of his own library and looked at her. And something happened that he did not have an immediate category for. Not desire. Or, not only that, something more complicated and less comfortable. A recognition of something, of a quality in her that the past 2 weeks of watching had been building toward, and that was suddenly, in this unguarded moment, completely visible. She had been through something that would have broken most people into pieces loud enough to hear from the next room. And she had absorbed it so completely, processed it so deeply, and so privately, that she was sitting in the library of the man who had received her as payment for her family's debt. And she had built herself a morning routine, and she had made friends with the staff, and she was reading books, and she was present, and she was whole, and she was asleep in the afternoon light, like someone who had decided, in the most fundamental possible way, not to be destroyed. He looked at her for a long time. Then he left. He found Hyun in the corridor. The blanket from the upstairs storage, the heavy one. Put it in the library. Leave it on the chair. Hyun looked at him. The chair by the west window, he said. Yes, sir. He went to his office. He sat at his desk and looked at his work, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has spent his life being ruthlessly honest with himself about what is actually happening around him, that something had shifted. He did not know yet what to do with that, but he didn't pretend it hadn't happened. That was something. The morning he spoke to her, first really spoke, not the transaction of the penthouse, but an actual conversation, was 3 weeks after her arrival. He was in the East Garden earlier than usual. He went there sometimes when he needed to think without the structured quality of the office pressing in on him. The garden was formal clipped hedges, stone paths, a long reflecting pool that ran the length of the east wall, but the end of it opened into something less curated. Old trees, a wooden bench, the sound of birds. Simone was already there. He stopped when he saw her. She was sitting on the bench at the far end, facing away from him, her morning tea, her book, closed in her lap, just sitting, looking at the trees. She heard him on the path and turned. They looked at each other. He had 2 options, and he chose the honest one, which was to keep walking. He reached the bench. He stood for a moment. She moved slightly, not dramatically, just a small shift that made room. He sat down. They were quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that could have been uncomfortable, and wasn't. You come here every morning, he said. Yes, no apology in it, no checking whether it was a problem, just yes. Why this end? He asked. The path closest to the house gets more light. She considered the question seriously. He liked that the pause, that meant she was actually thinking about it, rather than just answering. It's quieter, she said. The other end is beautiful, but you can hear the gates from there. The security changes. I like not hearing that. He understood that. He didn't say so. They were quiet again. Then he said, Are you comfortable here? It was not a warm question. He wasn't sure he knew how to ask warm questions. It was a direct question, the kind he asked his staff when he needed an honest status report. She turned and looked at him with those eyes that he had spent 3 weeks watching through a monitor, and that were different, sharply and oddly different, when they were looking at him directly. Yes, she said, your staff are kind. The library is extraordinary. A small pause. The East Garden is my favorite. He nodded. Is there anything you need? He asked. She considered that pause again. No, she said. Thank you. He nodded again. He stayed on the bench for another 10 minutes. They didn't speak again. But it wasn't silence that needed to be filled. It was just 2 people in the same early morning, with the trees and the birds and the sound of the water in the reflecting pool, existing in the same space. He had a meeting at 8. He stood, straightened his jacket. She looked up. Good morning, she said. The first time she had said it to him, something moved across his face that he was too disciplined to let fully form. "Good morning," he said. He walked back up the path. He was 3 minutes late to his first call of the day, which had never happened before. He did not examine why. That was the beginning. It was slow after that. Deliberately, carefully slow. Not because either of them was playing a game, but because she had learned not to grab at good things too fast in case they weren't real, and he had spent so many years in a world where everything had a price that he no longer trusted good things to simply be good. They were both, in different ways, people who had been trained out of easy trust. So it went slowly. He started appearing in the East Garden in the mornings with a regularity that could no longer be called coincidence. He never acknowledged it as a decision. She never pointed it out. They simply both happened to be there. And they talked, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for 30, about things that were, at first, perfectly neutral. The estate's history. The architecture of the West Wing. A book she was reading that he had read years earlier. The way the light hit the reflecting pool at different times of day. Small things, safe things. But the conversations lasted longer each time. And then one morning she said something about her family, not the contract, not the penthouse, just a small specific detail about growing up in a house where the shelves were full of framed photos of her brother, and there was not a single one of her, not because anyone had decided to exclude her, but because no one had ever decided to include her. And he went very still. Not uncomfortable, not pitying, just still. The kind of stillness that means someone is listening with everything they have. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words. He was not effusive. He was not going to perform empathy he didn't have. But those 2 words, from him, in that tone she understood they were real. She looked at her tea. "It made me very good at being quiet," she said. "At being present without being noticed. I suppose that's been useful." And he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It shouldn't have been necessary." She looked up at him. He was looking at the trees. Profile sharp in the morning light, not looking at her, giving her space to receive what he had just said, without the pressure of being watched. She understood that. She turned back to the trees, too. They sat together until his phone reminded him of a 9 o'clock call. He told her things, too. Not quickly, not easily. He was not built for easy disclosure. But it happened. Late one evening, she was in the library when he appeared in the doorway, not looking for her, she thought, just ending up there the way he had started ending up in the East Garden. He had a glass of something in his hand, and he looked at the book she was holding and said, "Is that any good?" She told him. He came in, sat down in the chair across from hers. He told her about his father. Not the whole story, just the shape of it. A man who had built something enormous and believed that the building of it excused everything else. Every coldness, every absence, every decision made without consulting the people it affected most. A man who had handed his son an empire and called it love. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, he thought the thing he built was the same as the person he was supposed to be. They aren't the same. He looked at her. "No," he said, "they aren't." A pause. "Is that how it was for you?" he asked. "Your family?" She thought about it, really thought about it. "They thought providing was the same as seeing me," she said. "They're not the same either." He nodded slowly. They stayed in the library until past midnight, talking not about the contract, not about the circumstances that had put her in his house, but about the things underneath those circumstances, about what it does to a person to grow up feeling like a background detail in their own story, about what it costs to build your identity entirely from the inside because the outside keeps not acknowledging you, about the particular loneliness of being powerful, which she understood from a different angle, but understood nonetheless the way power of any kind changes how people relate to you, makes them perform rather than connect. She fell asleep in the chair again, eventually. He didn't leave immediately. He sat across from her in the lamplight and looked at her for a while. Then he got up and found the blanket his housekeeper had left on a shelf nearby and put it over her. He stood there for a moment after that. Then he turned off the lamp and left. Now here is where we have to pause for a moment, because this is the part of the story where things could get complicated. A woman in a man's house. A contract that put her there. Power that was clearly not equal between them. These are real things. They don't disappear just because the man in question turns out to be more human than the night in the penthouse suggested. Simone was not naive about this. She was, in fact, one of the most clear-eyed people in this story. She understood exactly what her situation was and exactly what it was not, and she did not confuse his growing attention for something it hadn't proven itself to be yet. But she also trusted what she could see. And what she could see was this. He had never once used the power he had over her situation. He had never reminded her of the contract. And he had never made her feel that her presence in his home was conditional on her performing gratitude or compliance or anything other than simply being who she was. He had put a blanket on a chair because she fell asleep there. He sat in the East Garden because she was there, and he wanted to be where she was. He told her about his father, a man she understood he had never told anyone about, because something about her made it possible to say true things. She knew the difference between a man who wanted to own her and a man who was slowly and imperfectly and without any clear roadmap learning to care about her. She had spent 24 years in a house with people who were supposed to care about her. She knew what the real thing looked like. And this, whatever this was the beginning of the real thing. It was around this time that her family decided they weren't done yet. She wasn't there when it arrived, the communication, delivered through an intermediary, smooth and businesslike and completely without shame. A second debt had been identified. New terms were being proposed. The logic, as presented, was almost elegant in its ugliness. Simone was with Kang Dae-won. That connection had value. Surely they could discuss arrangements. They believed that transferring her had been a transaction with ongoing returns. They believed she was still currency, just stored somewhere new. Kang Dae-won received this communication on a Wednesday morning. He read it once. He didn't call Simone. He didn't show it to her. He didn't ask her how she felt about it or whether she wanted to be involved in the response. He made 3 calls. The third one was to his assistant. Set up the boardroom for Thursday, he said. The Harper family. All of them. Yes, sir. Would you like me to inform? Tell Simone, he said. Tell her she's needed. Thursday, 10 o'clock. A pause. Tell her to wear whatever she wants, he said. She doesn't dress for them. Not anymore. She wore ivory, clean and bright and entirely her own choice. She did her hair the way she liked it. She wore shoes she had bought herself from the allowance he had set up for her without announcement, just a notification from his financial team that an account had been opened in her name and she could use it however she chose. She arrived at the corporate tower at 9:45. His assistant met her at the entrance and walked her up in the private elevator, talking quietly about the morning schedule and what was in the boardroom and what the setup looked like. Simone listened and nodded and stepped out onto the executive floor, feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Ready. The boardroom was on the top floor, glass walls overlooking the city bright outside, sun high and clear, the kind of morning that makes everything look sharp-edged and possible. She walked in. The room was already configured a long table, high-backed chairs, the kind of space designed to communicate through its proportions alone that the people in it are not equal. She understood immediately what was at the head of the table and she walked to it and she sat down. Not to the side. Not in a chair near the door. At the head. She folded her hands on the table and she waited. The senior staff in the room, 2 of his executive assistants, a legal representative, registered this without comment. They arranged themselves accordingly. And when her family was shown in her father first, her mother behind him, Elijah at the rear, they walked into the room and stopped. Because there was their daughter, their afterthought, sitting at the head of a table in a building that cost more than everything they had ever owned, in a room where the people in it were already deferring to her, in a position that did not match in any way the version of her they had last seen in that apartment, turning over a card with a restaurant address on it. Her father opened his mouth. He didn't get anything out. Because Kang Dae-won walked in, the room changed. The staff straightened. The air became intentional. He moved across the floor with the specific quality of a man who has never once in his life needed to announce himself, because every room he enters does it for him. He stood in the center. He looked at her family. Not a long look. He didn't need long looks. He needed about 3 seconds to communicate everything that was going to happen in the next 10 minutes. You came to negotiate, he said. Her father began. What you did, Kang Dae-won said, with the quiet of a man who has never needed volume, was a transaction you believed had ongoing returns. Her father tried again. It did not. It was a forfeiture. He let that land. There are no ongoing returns. There will not be any. This conversation will not happen again. He walked to where Simone was seated. He stood beside her. He placed his hand on her shoulder, not gently, not softly, not in the way of someone offering comfort, in the way of a man making a statement to a room that needs to understand it completely and permanently. He looked at her family. The woman you raised to disappear, he said, is the only person in this room I would take everything apart to protect. Silence. Total, airless, complete silence. Then, quieter, lower. Almost, for her, but not quite because they needed to hear it too. They counted you as nothing. His eyes didn't leave her family. They were counting the wrong things. Her father left first. Her mother followed without speaking. Elijah was last. He paused at the door and looked back at his sister. One long, complicated look that contained, Simone thought, the beginning of something she was not ready to name yet. Then he left too. The door closed. The room breathed again. Kang Dae-won looked down at her. She looked up at him. Something passed between them in that moment that didn't need words. An acknowledgement. A recognition. The specific quiet of two people who have just shared something that cannot be undone. Thank you, she said. He shook his head, very slightly. Don't thank me, he said. It was true. She thought that was the end of her family. She was wrong. The end of her family, the real end, the one that would close things permanently and reshape everything, came about 4 months later. On a Tuesday, her mother called. She almost didn't answer. She and her mother had not spoken since the boardroom. There had been a few messages, her mother's particular style of communication, when she was ashamed of herself, which was to send small, meaningless updates about household things, as a way of maintaining contact without having to acknowledge what the contact was actually about. Simone had read them. She had not responded. But the call was different. Her mother didn't call. Her mother avoided the directness of calls the way she avoided the directness of most things. So Simone answered. It's Elijah, her mother said. Her voice was different. Not the carefully composed voice of a woman managing her presentation. The voice of a person who has been crying for a long time and has run out of the energy to hide it. What happened? Simone asked. Her mother told her. Elijah had been sick for 6 weeks before they told her. 6 weeks of hospital visits and tests and second opinions and the particular desperate hope of people who are not ready to hear what the doctors are telling them and keep looking for a different answer. The answer didn't change. Acute liver failure. Not the gradual kind, not the kind you manage with medication and lifestyle and careful monitoring over years. The acute kind. Fast. Aggressive. The kind that operates on its own timeline regardless of what you want. He needed a transplant. He needed one soon. The waiting list was long, and the private surgical team that could move faster cost more money than the Harper family had ever had access to, even in their best years, and their best years were behind them. They had sold everything they could sell. They had borrowed everything anyone would lend them. They had talked to every contact and called in every favor, and reached the end of all of it, with a number still far short of what they needed. There was one option left. Hair. Simone sat very still while her mother talked. She thought about Elijah. She thought about the 3 weeks ago date on that notary stamp. She thought about his countersignature. She thought about what it meant to have a brother who had signed his sister over to a stranger and then gone home and eaten dinner. She thought about him in a hospital bed right now, 27 years old, with his body failing him in a way that no amount of being the golden child could protect against. She thought about her family's theology, sons carry the legacy, daughters are temporary, and how it had organized everything in their house for as long as she could remember. She thought about how the foundation had turned out to need the furniture after all. She took a breath. I'll hear what you have to say, she said. Come to the estate. They came the next morning. Her father, her mother, and smaller than she remembered. Somehow, though, that was probably her imagination, Elijah. He was not in the hospital today. He was here. He had insisted on coming himself, her mother had said on the phone, and Simone had said fine. They sat in the receiving room on the first floor, bright and formal, with tall windows and pale walls, and arrangements of white flowers on the side tables. Simone had specifically chosen this room. She had thought about it carefully. Not a room where he had any furniture or authority, not a neutral hallway, but a room that was undeniably part of the space she now occupied. She sat across from them, not beside Kang Dae-won. He was not present for this part. She had asked him, quietly, the night before, if she could handle this one herself. He had looked at her for a moment, then he had said, whatever you need. She sat across from her family and she looked at each of them and let the silence sit for a moment before she spoke. I want to hear it from you, she said, not from an intermediary, not summarized. I want you to tell me what happened, what you need, and what you're asking me for. Her father told her. He was careful about it. He was always careful. He had the particular talent of a man who has made a series of wrong decisions and learned to present them in language that emphasizes circumstances over choices. The debt had grown. The situation had been more severe than anticipated. Elijah's illness had arrived on top of an already fragile financial structure. The options had been exhausted. He did not apologize. Not in those first minutes. Her mother was crying quietly, not performing at genuine tears, steady and old-looking, the tears of someone who had been crying about this for weeks. Elijah didn't speak. When her father was done, Simone looked at her brother. Elijah, she said. He looked up. I want to hear from you, she said. He looked like he had aged several years, not just the illness, though, that was visible, in his coloring and the way he held himself. Something else. Something that happens to a person when they have had to spend 6 weeks in the particular company of their own mortality, and have had no choice but to actually look at the life they've been living. I signed it, he said. No preamble, no careful presentation. I knew what it was. They explained it to me. I told myself we didn't have a choice, but that wasn't. He stopped. We had choices. The choice was whether to find a different way or to use you. And I chose the easier thing. Silence. I've thought about it every day since, he said. That doesn't change it. I know that. But I need you to know that I know what I did. Simone looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at her father. I want to make sure I understand the complete situation, she said. Her voice was even, not cold. Precise. Elijah needs a transplant. You don't have the funds for the private team. You've exhausted every other option, and you're asking me to provide the difference. Yes, her father said. I understand, she said. Then, I'll help him. Her mother's exhale filled the room. On my terms, Simone said. Only my terms, and you will agree to all of them before I make a single call. Her father nodded. I need to hear you say yes, she said. Not a nod. Yes. Yes, her father said. Yes, her mother said, voice unsteady. She looked at Elijah. Yes, he said, quietly. Whatever you need. She laid out the terms, not with cruelty, not with the particular savagery of a person who has finally found themselves in a position of power over those who wrong them and intends to make the most of it. With clarity, she wanted acknowledgement, her father, in writing, on record, stating clearly and without softened language that what had been done to her was wrong. Not circumstances, not difficult decisions, wrong. A written statement that she kept. She wanted Elijah when he was well enough, and she said this with a steadiness that indicated she was not treating his recovery as uncertain, that she had already decided he was going to recover, to sit with her and tell her the truth, the full truth, not summarized, not managed, all of it. She wanted no future claims, no future negotiations, no future intermediaries with second debts or new proposals. Her name, her marriage, her children, her life with Kang Dae-won untouchable. Permanently. This was not a negotiable term. She wanted her mother to call her every week for the next year. Not a text, a call. Not a performance of closeness she didn't feel, just a call, 30 minutes. Her mother's actual voice, talking about actual things. The beginning of something that should have existed from the beginning. That last one made her mother cry harder. Simone waited. "Do we have an agreement?" she asked. They agreed. She picked up her phone. She made the call to Kang Dae-won's financial team that would arrange everything within 24 hours. Then she stood. "Hyun will show you out," she said. She left the room. She walked to the East Garden and sat on the bench at the far end and looked at the trees. She didn't cry. She just sat with it, all of it, the whole shape of everything. The penthouse, and the 17 minutes, and the signatures, and the receiving room, and her mother's face, and Elijah looking at his hands and the particular, strange, enormous fact that she had just saved the life of the person who had signed her away. She sat with all of it until it settled into something she could carry. Then she made herself tea. "Don't go anywhere. We are not done yet. The best part of this story is still coming." Elijah's surgery was 3 weeks later. It went well. Better than well, the private team was as good as their price tag suggested, and he came through cleanly. The recovery was going to be long, months of careful management, but he was going to be okay. Simone received the update from the surgical team. She sat with it for a moment. Then she sent a message to her mother. "Good. Let me know how the recovery goes." Her mother called immediately, not waiting for the scheduled weekly call. Simone answered. It was the first real conversation they had ever had. Not the first conversation they had been having, surface conversations, Simone's entire life, but the first real one, where both of them were present and honest and not performing the easier version of what was happening. Her mother cried again, said things she should have said years ago, said them imperfectly. She was not a person who had a lot of practice saying true things out loud, but she said them. Simone listened. Then she said, "I know, Mom." 2 words that cost her something and gave her something at the same time. The call lasted an hour. Kang Dae-won found her in the garden afterward. He had not been in the estate when the family came. He had kept his distance deliberately. This was hers to do, and he understood that completely. He had left before they arrived, and he came back after. He found her on the bench at the far end. He sat down. "How are you?" he asked. She considered the question. Really considered it. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm okay. Which is strange, because I expected to feel either worse or better, and I feel somewhere in between. Like something that was very tightly coiled has just let go." He nodded. He understood coiled things letting go. "I'm glad you did it your way," he said. "I wanted to go in there and—" He stopped. "But it was yours. It needed to be yours." She looked at him. "Thank you for understanding that," she said. He looked ahead at the trees. Then, without looking at her, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "The contract." He paused. He was not a man who paused. It was strange to see. "It has been legally void for the past 2 months. My legal team processed the dissolution at my request." She stared at him. "You've been here because you chose to be," he said. "Not because of any document. I should have told you sooner." He finally looked at her. "I didn't know how to tell you without it sounding like—" Another pause, without it changing what was happening between us. "I didn't want you to think you had to—" "Kang Dae-won," she said. He stopped. "I knew," she said. He looked at her. "The legal team processed it through the estate account. I have access to the estate accounts. I found it about 6 weeks ago." She held his gaze steadily. "I stayed because I chose to." Something moved across his face. Something complicated and very honest and entirely unguarded. "I stayed," she said, "because this is where I want to be. Because the East Garden is my favorite place I've ever found. Because Hyun leaves fruit by the kettle in the mornings, and there is a library with a ladder, and the light comes through the west windows at exactly the right time in the late afternoons." She paused. "Because you put a blanket on the chair." He was very still. "And because you are the first person in my life who has ever said the word wrong about the way I was treated and meant it fully without wanting something back." Silence. Not the absence of sound kind. The full kind. The kind that contains something. He reached over. He took her hand. Not dramatically, not with a speech or a gesture, just reached over and took her hand the way you take something you intend to keep. She let him. She turned her hand over and held his back. They sat in the east garden until the light changed, and neither of them said anything else, and it was exactly enough. He asked her to marry him in the library. Of course he did. Not a plan, or not a visible plan. Just an evening in the library, the two of them on opposite sides of the fireplace with books, the easy, comfortable silence that had become one of her favorite things about her life, and he looked up from his book and looked at her for a long moment and said, "I want you to stay forever." She looked up from her book. He said, "I want to marry you, if you want that." She looked at him, this man who had entered her life as a transaction and become the architecture of her first real home, and she didn't cry, and she didn't perform joy, and she didn't rush to fill the moment with more words than it needed. She said, "Yes." He nodded, like it was decided. Then he went back to his book. She went back to hers. Then she put her book down and started laughing, really laughing, not politely, not carefully. And he looked up at her with that expression he had that wasn't quite a smile, but contained everything a smile contained. And something warm and wide and completely uncomplicated opened up in the room between them, and neither of them tried to close it. They married in the spring, Saturday, late morning, the estate garden, which had been transformed with white and pale gold arrangements, nothing theatrical, nothing that competed with the actual day. Just clean and bright and beautiful, the way good things are when they don't need to perform. Simone walked through the garden toward him. She wore white, not the ivory of the boardroom or the borrowed gown of the penthouse, but white chosen by her, for this day, that was entirely and finally and irreversibly hers. She carried small pale flowers she had chosen herself from the estate greenhouse. She walked slowly. She was not nervous. That was the thing she noticed as she walked, the absence of the anxiety she had expected, the old habit of bracing herself for the ground to shift, for the good thing to have conditions she hadn't yet found. There was no bracing. There was just the garden, and the morning light, and Kang Dae-won at the end of the path, watching her with that face that opened when he looked at her. She reached him. He took her hands. He held them like they were the most valuable thing in any room he had ever stood in, which they were, which they had been for longer than he had initially admitted to himself. They said their vows quietly, not loud enough for the whole gathering to hear clearly these words were for them, and the people close enough to hear them were exactly the right people. When it was done, he looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, just for her, "I'm glad you didn't go." She squeezed his hands. "I'm glad I stayed," she said. 2 years later, on a rainy Thursday morning that couldn't have cared less about its own significance, Simone Kang gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, 3 minutes apart. Both of them arrived with the full volume confidence of people who have decided from the very first second that the world was assembled specifically for their benefit. The boy first, loud and certain. The girl 3 minutes behind him, equally loud and significantly more indignant about the whole situation. Kang Dae-won held them both. He was not a man who had ever described himself as someone who wanted this, the weight of something small and entirely dependent pressed against his chest. The radical vulnerability of caring about something you cannot fully protect. He had spent his life building walls against exactly this kind of exposure. He held his son and his daughter in that hospital room and felt every single wall come down at once and found, to his profound surprise, that he did not miss them. He looked at Simone over their heads. She looked back at him. He had an expression she had spent 2 years learning to read, an expression that he had never worn for anyone before her, and had not known he was capable of. Pure, simple, total love. She reached across and touched his face. He turned into it the way he always did, like a reflex, like the most natural thing. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi," he said. The babies made their opinions known again. He looked down at them and then back up at her, and something shifted in his expression that was almost sheepish. "They're loud," he said. "They're perfect," she said. He looked down again. "Yes," he said. "They are." Elijah recovered fully. It took 8 months and 2 surgeries, and a confrontation with his own character that left marks the good kind, the kind that change how a person moves through the world. When he was strong enough, he called his sister and asked if they could meet. They met at a small restaurant, not fancy, just a table and 2 cups of coffee, and the whole unedited truth. He told her everything, not the version that made him look better, the actual version. He told her what he had told himself when he signed the document, and why those things were not true, and what he understood now that he had not understood then. He told her he was sorry. He told her sorry wasn't sufficient, but it was what he had, and he would spend however long she needed proving he meant it through how he actually lived, not through how he talked about it. Simone listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she was quiet for a moment. "I believe you," she said. He looked up. "I'm not going to tell you it's okay," she said, "because it wasn't. But I believe that you mean what you're saying, and I'm willing to find out over time what that means for us." She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm not your enemy, Elijah. I never was. Even when I had every reason to be." He was quiet. "I have twins now," she said. Something shifted in his face. "A boy and a girl," she said. "They're 10 months old and absolutely exhausting." He almost smiled. "Maybe you'd like to meet them sometime," she said. "When you're ready. When I think you're ready." He nodded. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." It was not a perfect resolution. It was not a sudden transformation or a clean slate, or the kind of reconciliation that arrives in a wave and washes everything away. It was a beginning, which was, under the circumstances, more than enough. Her mother called every week for a year, every single week, without missing one. She called on Sunday evenings, 30 minutes. And at first, the calls were careful and slightly stiff and full of the particular awkwardness of 2 people trying to build something that should have existed for decades and is starting from almost nothing. But they got better. Slowly, imperfectly, week by week, they got better. Her mother told her things about her own childhood that Simone had never known, about how she had been raised and what she had absorbed, and how the theology of sons and daughters had been handed to her by her own mother and her mother's mother, and how she had never once thought to question it until she was sitting in a receiving room watching her daughter lay down terms for her brother's life. "I'm so sorry," her mother said on one of those Sunday calls, maybe 6 months in. "I knew you deserved more. I knew it. I just didn't fight for it. For you. And there is no version of that I can make okay." Simone was quiet for a moment. "Mom," she said. "I know," her mother said. "I know. Sorry isn't. Call me next Sunday," Simone said. Her mother was quiet. "That's what I want," Simone said. "Call me next Sunday and the Sunday after that. That's what you can give me now." "I will," her mother said. "Okay," Simone said. She didn't forgive easily. She didn't pretend the past had not been what it was. But she also understood with the same clear-eyed honesty that she brought to everything that carrying the full weight of her family's failures into the rest of her life would cost her more than it cost them. She was not willing to pay that cost. She had something too good to poison with it. On a Sunday morning in early autumn, Simone sat in the East Garden with her tea. The twins were 18 months old. They were inside with their father, who had reorganized his entire morning schedule to accommodate the specific chaos of 2 toddlers who had recently discovered stairs and had opposing opinions about every decision put before them. She could hear them from the garden. The girl, fierce and loud and thoroughly, her father's daughter in temperament if not in tactics, had apparently taken issue with the breakfast arrangement. The boy, more patient, more observational, watching everything with wide, quiet eyes that made Simone think of the library chair and the East Garden bench, and a specific quality of attention she had fallen in love with was probably sitting nearby, Considering his options, she heard Kang Dae-won's voice, low, calm, negotiating with a toddler with the same focused seriousness he brought to everything. A pause. The girl's voice, raised. Another pause. Then quiet. Then the sound of Kang Dae-won, who had never laughed easily or publicly, laughing. Simone wrapped both hands around her tea and looked at the trees and felt something that she had no single word for, but that was made up of all the following things: stillness and warmth, and the particular satisfaction of a life that is actually yours, and the specific gratitude of a person who knows, really knows, from the inside of having not had it what it means to be finally, completely seen. She was nobody's afterthought. She was not furniture, not currency, not legacy by proxy, not a transaction, with ongoing returns. She was Simone Kang. She was the woman who had survived being counted as nothing long enough to become everything. And in a bright, warm house with a garden that faced east, a man who had once believed that the only things worth building were things you could control was currently losing a breakfast negotiation with a toddler who had inherited her mother's absolute certainty that she deserved to take up exactly the right amount of space in any room she entered. Not too much, not too little, exactly the right amount, just like her mother had always deserved and had, finally, found. If this story moved you, if Simone's quiet strength, her patience, and the way she finally came home to herself stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Some stories are meant to find the right person at the right time. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about women who survive being invisible and build something extraordinary on the other side of it, you know where to find us. Subscribe and turn on notification bell to get updated on the next story. We'll see you in the next one.